If you put that to a countrywide Democratic vote, you'd probably get Christmas removed from the calendar, because that's how widespread this dissatisfaction with Christmas really is. I interviewed my mom a couple of days ago. I wanted to know what she thought Christmas really meant, and she had a super interesting take. What do you think is the most important thing about Christmas?
The presents.
Presents!
Huge mountain of presents.
Now, there's no shortage of people in the United States who think this way. She's totally right. It's just that coming from my mom, who's a devout Christian, it did take me a bit by surprise. Now, in 2015, the United States crossed a really important threshold. For the first time in history, there were more people who thought of it as like a cultural holiday as opposed to a religious one. And that trend continues on. It's more like 55 or 56% now. This video is really not about a so-called war on Christmas.
As for Merry Christmas, you write Jesus freak on it?
There are wars all over the world. There are innocent people starving. And the major controversy of the day, a red Starbucks cup.
I couldn't care less about that. It's about a more worrying trend, and it's the reason that 45% of Americans wish that they could just skip the holiday altogether.
Turns out you're more likely to have a heart attack during the holidays.
69% of Americans would skip exchanging gifts.
But let's go back to why Christmas exists in the first place, because it did actually serve a really important purpose in the development of the United States as a superpower. Christmas almost didn't exist in the US. Prior to the 19th century, it was a primarily European holiday that took many different forms throughout the centuries. Some of the customs at the time might be recognizable to us today as Christmas. For example, Christmas trees have been used in Germany for 500 years, and eggnog was actually invented in Jamestown. By the way, eggnog should always be served with rum. That's how it was originally done, and I'll be damned if you can do it any other way. Christmas almost didn't exist in the US because after its war for independence, the new Americans were trying to reject everything English, and that was seen as one of those things that was English. I mean, not to mention the Puritans, when they came to power in England, they banned Christmas altogether, and so eventually that's part of the reason they came to the US in the first place. You can imagine that that influence continued for a long time. Christmas celebrations continued being taboo or even outright illegal in Puritan colonies for hundreds of years, until, again, the mid-19th century. Puritan views didn't change much, but their grasp on the American culture and the way of life waned over time, as a really important change was underpinning American everyday life. Prior to this, the family, like the family unit, like, you know, mom, dad, brother, sister, whatever, existed solely as an engine of discipline. It was meant to raise good people who worked hard, and that was pretty much it. They worked, they got punished, they worked some more, and they were raised into normal human beings, or what was seen as normal human beings at the time. During the mid-19th century, that family unit transitioned into a more nurturing and emotional one. And you can think of it as like, for the first time in history, kids were finally allowed to just be kids. Technology was advancing, people had more leisure time, and it was really the first time in history that at least poor people could just spend time with their kids for the sake of spending time with their kids. There was really no better vehicle for this transition than Christmas. Especially with the widespread adoption of Santa Claus, parents could really just avoid the guilt of spoiling their children. For both parents and kids, Santa took toys and gifts out of the realm of retail. Finally, parents could give kids just to see the joy on their faces just because they were kids. It finally became more acceptable to take time off work, especially for, you know, those poor families, to just spend time with family for the sake of spending time with family. That was it. That was the purpose that I was talking about earlier. There were other factors at play, but Christmas quite literally was reinvented in the United States for the purpose of transitioning us from the Industrial Revolution into the Technological Revolution, which was an era that saw more leisure time and a generally better life for people in this part of the world. Okay, lots of like super important stuff happened, but skip ahead with me to the middle of the 20th century, or what I'll call the dawn of the digital revolution.
The sound picture you are about to see and hear.
By the time a woman assembles a complete spring wardrobe.
The dawn of the digital revolution, the middle of the 20th century, new forms of media are rapidly claiming their audiences. They're called radio and a little bit later TV. And they ushered in a new era of what I'll call cheapism, I guess. I don't really know what to call it, but it's the first time ever that there could be an American audience who's like all watching the same thing, all listening to the same thing, all getting the same information. Likewise, it's the first time ever that there's like this ideal version of Christmas that's created that, and it's still the image that's burned into our little nostalgic minds, because that's what it originally was, when there was one single idea, like this is what Christmas is supposed to look like.
And now that star is crooked.
That 40s image of what Christmas is supposed to look like is so burned into our minds that even more modern movies like A Christmas Story take place during that era. It takes place in the 40s. Now, pause here for a second to say that I understand that A Christmas Story was made in the 80s and is not that modern. It sounds like so long ago. But it's one of those movies that everybody watches every year, and it's just like something like 100 million times a year, some crazy number.
You'll shoot your eye out, kid. Merry Christmas. Ho, ho, ho.
Anyway, unpause, totally irrelevant. These new forms of mass media gave way to a more or less universal vision of what Christmas is supposed to look like. But it also changed something else that we see and interact with every day. That's marketing.
Ronald McDonald.
Lots of exciting action and fun for everyone when the world...
Marketing is probably a practice that's as old as the first caveman, and even Coca-Cola really reinvented what we think of Santa Claus in a 1931 magazine, which is a fact that I deleted earlier in the script, so I guess it's not that important. Mass marketing has changed the way that we think about everything, forever. And there's no place more emblematic of that than Christmas. In 1944, when this idealistic vision of Christmas was really invented, the per capita spending on Christmas was $235. By 2015, that same metric was pushing $2 grand, or nearly 5% of per capita income. 5%! The average person actually spends 5% of their income on the holiday. In the mid-90s, Cambridge University conducted a linguistics study to look at the language most associated with Christmas. I'm just going to read this one here. Some of the words most associated with Christmas were wonderful, glow, entertaining, colorful games, and holly. By 2015, those words, the ones I just mentioned, fell off the list and were replaced by words like sale, trading, spend, special, retail, party, and yes, hangover. I can only assume you guessed hangover. It's no surprise then that the greatest increase in spending actually occurred during the same period, in the decade that we call the 90s, which is when I grew up, with all money spent on the Christmas holiday nearly doubling just in that decade. And the pressure to spend more, buy more, get your kids more is only going up. We've entered a new revolution, the information revolution, where not only does marketing dominate our lives, with the advent of social media, widespread peer pressure, we have a lot more to compare our shortcomings to. So going back to my mom, she has these really unnatural emotions attached to Christmas where she thinks that she has to do this for her kids or they're not going to have a good childhood. Rewind again and remember the entire purpose of Christmas in the first place, the 19th century version, more modern Christmas. The original purpose was just to see the joy on kids' faces. Parents really wanted to see the joy on kids' faces. And even today, that's exactly what parents think they're doing, or at least that's what mine always said. We were never wealthy. Dare I say, we were even poor for most of my childhood. But my mom went big on Christmas, always. And in this interview, she said that if she had to do it all over again, she would do exactly the same thing. But kids aren't like the way they were in the 1800s. They generally get other stuff throughout the year. They have free time, they have fun, and a real education. Add to that, we're spending nearly 10 times on Christmas what we were when that idealistic vision of what Christmas looked like was invented in the 40s. Never mind the 1800s when this tradition developed. The world where this is necessary is gone. I mean, like, long gone. The truth is, this is actually pretty bad for us, both parents and kids. I already touched on one of the issues for adults, and that's guilt. My mom felt guilty if she couldn't buy us everything that we wanted. I hate this. I hate the way that it made my mom feel. Absolutely hate it. Growing up, I knew it. I hated it. It caused her to go into debt. It caused her to bounce checks. Even going as far as predatory payday loans and buying stuff just on credit cards that really never got paid off. That guilt leads to a certain financial pressure that is hardly unique to my mom. It's so ingrained into our cultural identity that 59% of Americans expect to take holiday debt into the new year. And as many as 18% of Americans will go to one of those scummy, predatory payday loan places just for gift expenses. And 45% of Americans say that they wish we could skip Christmas altogether because of the financial pressure. If you put that to a countrywide Democratic vote, you'd probably get Christmas removed from the calendar, because that's how widespread this dissatisfaction with Christmas really is. But this spending isn't just difficult for parents. Remember the kids and how the original purpose was to see them happy? Well, it might work. I mean, you see the smile on their faces when they first open up their gifts. But science shows us that more gifts are actually worse for kids. I know it sounds counterintuitive, but there's more than one reason that this is true. Unstructured play with simple or open-ended toys, like ones with multiple purposes, is actually really good for their neural development. I covered this better in another video. I'll post a link in the description below. But kids need the opportunity to see how things interact with each other. More complex toys aren't as good at connecting with the world around them. They have one single purpose, and kids expect them to do something. Add to that, it makes it harder to actually play with other kids if you just have a toy that plays back with you. These more simple tools give kids a better opportunity to actually interact with other kids around them. According to a study from the University of Missouri, as adults, kids who get more and expensive gifts, especially ones that get better every year, are predisposed to addictive behaviors. That is to say, adults who, as kids, got more and better stuff, they tend to be more addicted to gambling, more addicted to compulsive shopping, and similar things like that, which kind of explains a lot in my own life. I don't know if that's funny or sad. Kids' brains are very malleable, and the older they get, the less malleable they are. In other words, the longer time goes, the more they're stuck with the predispositions you gave them in childhood. Constantly trying to one-up last year, or really any behavior that says this isn't enough. This isn't enough. And you're literally teaching them to take dumb, uncalculated risks. Number 3, kids actually play longer with fewer toys. What? I mean, how? I know this sounds counterintuitive, but the logic flows like this. A kid has a lot of toys. They play with one. They're constantly thinking the others are better. They drop the original one and they move on to the next. This cycle repeats itself until really they're just bored with all of them, and they come crying to mommy or daddy to make sure that they're entertained. When children have fewer toys, they're more likely to get creative with the ones that they have. So what is actually the perfect number of toys? Is it 100, 50, 25? I really had no idea. And those were sort of my first guesses, but there was a study, a 1979 study, studying toddlers. They tested different kids with different options: 3 toys, 12 toys, and 21 toys. And you'll never believe it, the kids with the 3 toys actually played the longest, longer than the 12 and longer than the 21, suggesting that the number of toys the kids are actually most happy with is a lot lower than you think. There were a lot more benefits of fewer toys than I went into details here, because I feel like this is already a really long video, but I'll go ahead and flash up a few more on the screen so you can just kind of take a gander. So the next section here, I really cannot stress how much I hated stuff as a kid. Don't get me wrong, I loved opening presents, but the stuff caused so much chaos in our lives. I remember one time, this also wasn't part of my original story here, but we went camping for a weekend trip, and what I remember from the camping trip, I don't even remember the camping trip, but what I remember from it is that we had this van, and it was, again, like 2 or 3 days, right? And we filled the van so high of stuff that there weren't even seats. We sat on top of the stuff. And I just remember thinking, like, what are we doing? I haven't really investigated any specific studies, but there's some science out there that suggests that that all of this stuff creates this a chaos and a sort of an unstable environment for kids. The stuff creates stress in their lives. And what we know from my previous video about brain development in kids is that stress is actually really harmful. You can make this is gonna sound so like whatever, but it actually makes you dumber. It makes it harder to make neural connections, and it might even take away from neural connections you've already made. So I won't go too far into that because I would need to cite some specific studies, but I think that that's really true in my own life, is that my parents would buy this stuff, and it was just all about stuff, right? And it's great seeing your kids so happy on Christmas. That's what it's all about, like they say. But the anxiety that comes with having to deal with that stuff actually takes away from their brain development. And even if you like, I mean, there's so much conflict that goes around like stuff and cleaning up your stuff and keeping organized and all of this. And you can teach a kid to be clean, you can teach a kid to be organized, but there's only so much that they should have to do it. And I don't believe for a second that we're in a healthy stage where all of this stuff that we have is actually worth it. Is worth it for the kids, is worth it for the parents. There's just no way. So popular movies like A Christmas Story gave us the ideal of what a Christmas is supposed to look like. And magazines and TV let us know that we were not matching up to that we could never stack up to those popular celebrities who had everything figured out. And when this new information age began with the internet and social media, we were put under even more pressure, not only marketing pressure, which came to really dominate every aspect of our lives, but also pressure from our peers. We get this constant reminder that we're not even as good as our next door neighbor, let alone the celebrity in the magazine. But there is actually a benefit to all of this. Without the information age, without the World Wide Web, without social media, we wouldn't have access to any of this information. Looking at my surroundings right now, I think YouTube has done a pretty good job of putting a box around my face. I know that was funny, whatever. With the aforementioned information, we have more options than we've ever had before, and when we have more encouragement to do the right thing. I mean, we find our communities online and we find people who think the same way, and that never existed before because you only had the people in your immediate surroundings. My mom, bless her, always did what she thought was the right thing. But if I can let you in on a little secret, it was in no small part because of the physical and emotional trauma that she experienced as a child. She wanted to give us the magical Christmas because as a child, it was really the only good memories that she had. As an adult, let's say before the information age, I may be more inclined to follow her lead. Just because that's the way it's always been, my dad says. That's the way it's always been, that's the way it's always gonna be. I'm painting my parents as super old, but they're actually not. They were teenagers when I was born. Or wait, that means I'm old. Never mind. In this new information age, I'm being swayed by an ever more passionate consumerist society. But I actually have access to real scientific studies that tell me what's good and what's bad. Perhaps more importantly, in this new information age, I can see that things aren't just the way they are because they've always been. I can see that our traditions are actually super new. Most of our Christmas traditions only go back 100 years, maybe 150 years. In this new information age, I can also see that not everyone does it the same. In up until the 90s or the 2000s, you could see that we had this idealistic vision of Christmas and what it was supposed to be, the magic that my mom experienced as a child, the magic that she always wanted to recreate for us, and maybe she always felt like she fell short. Nowadays, we can see that not everybody does what you think they do. This gives me the freedom and the power, or much more than my very young parents had in the 90s, to choose and ask the question, what do I want to do for Christmas? I know what I'm going to do, and I would implore you to spend more quality time with your family, but do like less stuff. I mean, like buy less stuff. It's an outdated tradition meant for one purpose. That purpose has been fulfilled and now bastardized to the point of non-recognition. You don't need it. Your kids will be worse off for it. And the environment, my God, I completely forgot to mention it. Anyway, I think that's probably for another video. Bye.